Okay, hi, I'm bored, so I wanted to just talk about something. I don't want to talk about the Sens game because that was one of the worst things I've ever watched. Um, Apparently, that's what happens when a stoppable force meets a movable object. Um, you get just really, really, really horrible viewing experiences. Um, I had a different idea for this video, but I couldn't find the information I needed. I think that idea would have been cooler than this. But yeah, I couldn't find the information I needed, and working it out myself would have been too hard. So I decided not to do that. I want to talk about the playoff format because lots of people don't seem to like the current playoff format, and I wanted an excuse to draw stuff in MS Paint. So here's what we're gonna do. For the current playoff format, I think most people are used to it by now, but when it was first introduced in like 2013 or 2014 or whatever it was, it's kind of confusing, and it still is a little bit confusing. And the way it works is that um, let's take the East for an example. You've got the Atlantic Division, not the Atlanta Division, the Atlantic Division, and the Metropolitan Division, not the Met Division, but the Metropolitan Division. And you've got one, two, three division winners. You've got one, two, three division winners. And then you've got the two wild card teams, which can come from either division, which also occurs in baseball and I think football as well. And then you've got water closet and water closet. Um, and the division winner with the higher point total plays the water closet. With the lower point total, the division winner with the lower point total plays the water closet with the I'm gonna start. It's not a funny joke. Plays the wild card with the higher point total. And then these two guys play against each other. And these two guys play against each other. And then they sort of go forward from there. Now, one of the main criticisms of this playoff setup, aside from the fact that it's confusing to understand at first, is that oftentimes these two and three teams over here are like Toronto and Boston play in the playoffs every year, it seems, and you end up with a very good team going home in the first round. Um, Whereas otherwise, within old playoff formats, they might have stayed alive longer because in the old playoff format, you would just go one, two, three. We'll come back to three and two in a second. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. One would play eight, two would play seven, three would play six, four would play five, and so on. And then they would get reseeded, which I was looking up information about different leagues, playoff formats. Apparently, in the NBA, they don't do reseeding. I'm not totally sure what the advantages of not reseeding versus reseeding are, but anyways, we'll get to that later. The two and three, the one, two, and three were always the division winners. Because back in those days they had three divisions in each conference. In the Eastern Conference at the time, they were called the Northeast Division, the Atlantic Division, which is different than today's Atlantic Division. The Atlantic Division back in the day was more similar to the Metropolitan Division of today, and the Southeast Division. So the division winners of these three divisions would automatically get one, two, and three, and therefore they would automatically get home ice advantage. And um, this is I'm not sure is a great idea because one year in particular I remember 2006 2007, which is my first full year of watching hockey, and this sort of made an impression on me. Ottawa went to the finals that year, but that's not important. They finished the fourth seed, and they played the five seed Pittsburgh in the first round, um, and that was fine. The second seed was New Jersey, who won the Atlantic Division, and they were a very, very good team. So that wasn't a problem. The first seed was the team with the most points in the Northeast Division and also in the conference, so that makes sense, which was the Sabres. And the third seed um, is where people might take issue because the third seed was the Thrashers. I didn't look this up beforehand for sure, but the Thrashers um, won the Southeast Division, but the Southeast Division at the time was notoriously terrible, and at that time they would be whoever came out of that kind of shit fest intact would get an automatic, not only automatic berth in the playoffs, but an automatic 3 seed and home ice advantage. So the Thrashers, I don't know if like they had enough points to qualify for the playoffs ordinarily. I assume they did, but I'm not sure. But they certainly would never be the 3 seed under quote unquote normal circumstances. And they played against the 6th seed, who was the Rangers, and the Rangers had I'm pretty sure they had more points than the Thrashers, and they swept them. The Rangers swept the Thrashers, and the Thrashers never won a game in the playoffs until they moved to Winnipeg, and in 2018, Winnipeg won Game 1 against the Minnesota Wild 11 years later. But this is the problem with that old format, um, is this whole idea of being in a really terrible division and getting home ice advantage in the playoffs just by virtue of being the least terrible team in a really, really bad division. Um, Now, obviously, in general, um, at least in theory, the divisions should be relatively even, but oftentimes it does turn out that they aren't even. And yeah, so I'm going to just clear everything for a second. So one thing that one sort of alteration you can make on this system, because lots of people like the 1-8 system because it's nice and simple to understand, and it makes a lot of sense, and like let's say under the new system, if Toronto and Boston would be the 3 seed or the 3 seed and the 4 seed respectively or whatever, they wouldn't have to play each other in the first round. 3 would play 6, which is ostensibly a weaker team, and 4 would play 5, which is ostensibly a weaker team. Um, and So one thing you can do to avoid this problem of like disparity in the strength of divisions and unfairly giving a team a higher seed than they on paper deserve is you can just do something to the effect of don't give them automatically the 3rd seed if they win the division, but just give them the spot that they would get otherwise. Like, let's say, okay, let's use the Thrashers example from the Southeast Division from the old days. Let's say the Thrashers finish with whatever. Let's say they get 98 points, and let's say the 6th seed has whatever 100 points, and the 7th seed has, let's say they have 97 points. Then instead of putting the Thrashers at the 3 seed automatically, when let's say the 2nd seed has whatever 112 points and the 4th seed has 107 points, then you just slot the Thrashers into the 7th seed. And let's say they have only whatever 93 points and the 8th seed has 96. Well, then you move everybody up and you slot them in the 8th seed. So they still get a playoff spot, but they get a playoff spot that's a little bit more fair because they don't have many points. I'm not saying it would occur that a division winner would have only 93 points, but instead of giving a 93-point team the 3 seed, you give the 93 team the 8 seed. And I think this potentially, and they are like really strength of an 8 seed, and they have to play the 1st seed in the first round. Makes sense. Um, I think so. I think if they were to go back to the 1-8 format, I think this is an alteration I would like to see made. But okay, going back to the new format, which I'm just going to draw it again really quickly. We've got 1, 2, 3, and on this side we've got 1, 2, 3, and we've got wild card, and we've got, what color do I want to use? Important decisions, and we've got wild card. Okay. One thing I really, really like about this playoff setup is that and this is sort of a controversial point because lots of people think this is actually a negative of this setup, but this is something I really like, is that the bracket is sort of separated by division. In the 1-8, you just sort of mix everybody up into the same sort of thing. But what I like is that the divisions are separated, not entirely separated, because of course there is a crossover with the 1 seed and the wild card and the 1 seed and the wild card. Usually the 1 seed will win that, and then it sort of goes back to being split up by division. Of course, in the last playoffs, all of the 1 seeds lost, but that is definitely an outlier. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that until in this case, the Eastern Conference Finals, the divisions are split, which means you get a lot of matchups within division. And using the example from earlier, the Toronto Boston thing that keeps occurring over and over, obviously not especially favorable for the Leafs at this point in time, and not especially happy a scenario for Leafs fans. But I like these sort of repeated matchups between teams in the same division because it gives a chance to sort of start rivalries, because the way rivalries start is you play each other in the playoffs and you play each other in the playoffs again and you start to hate each other, and you get to ignite sort of old rivalries like in 2018 and 19, the Leafs and Bruins. Well, there weren't very many players on the Leafs in 2018 that were the same as the team that faced Boston in 2013, but still you get to reignite that rivalry between the fan base. And I this setup encourages repeated matchups, I think. And that's something I really like because I like seeing teams play each other in the playoffs multiple times and sort of watch storylines grow and sort of watch the teams and fan bases start to hate each other more and more. Um, it's like Tampa and Detroit as well is a rivalry that I don't think would have ever developed organically if they hadn't played each other in the playoffs twice. That's just an example that comes to mind. Lots of people like to see different teams in the playoffs and it being all mixed up, and like to see matchups that have never occurred before. And you still get matchups that haven't occurred before. Like there was the one year where Ottawa played Boston and Toronto played Washington, and neither of these matchups had ever occurred before, despite all these teams existing in the league for a reasonable amount of time. You still get those, but you also encourage rivalries this way, I think. And some people don't like to see the same teams play the same teams over and over, but this is something I like about this setup. And I think it's one of the main reasons why I'd be a little bit sad if they went back to 1-8, despite the benefits of 1-8, which are sort of clear. I don't know. I would be kind of sad if they did that. Now, um, what are some other things that that can come into play here? Well, there is kind of the issue of, well, sort of parity between divisions, because always, you know, there's one division in each conference that's sort of better, like clearly better than the division in the other conference. And right now, it's the in the West, it's the Pacific Division that's weaker, and so you get teams um, potentially being able to qualify for a divisional spot that wouldn't have in the if it were just like it would just if it were just like a completely open field. That's always going to happen. It shouldn't happen in theory. Like in theory, everything should be like even between the divisions, but obviously in practice that's never going to happen. And the central teams in this case end up fighting for wild card spots, whereas if they were in the Pacific Division, then they would easily qualify for a division spot. And I think this is a valid point. Um, and it is a good argument for 1-8. Um, in general, I think the current playoff system is a bit weird, and I think 1-8 is probably objectively better. But I do think the current playoff system contains benefits that are cool that I like. Even if on paper it's probably objectively a bit questionable, um, because it puts a lot of emphasis on divisions, which leads to a sort of a potentially imbalance when one division sort of becomes stronger than the other. Right now, the Atlantic and the Metropolitan. I mean, I think the Atlantic's stronger, but I think they're good teams in both. Um, but yeah, the gap is sort of clearer in the Pacific, I think. Um, what was I going to say? Yeah, it puts a lot of emphasis on divisions, which can be bad for sort of, I guess, parity. But on the other hand, it puts a lot of emphasis on divisions, which is good for rivalries. Going back to 1-8 for a second, you could make the argument that you just forget about divisions entirely and you just give the playoff spots to the 8 teams with the highest point totals. You forget about division winner. I don't care. If you're a division winner but you suck, you get nothing. Um, I think it wouldn't occur very often, the scenario where the division winner doesn't have enough points to qualify for the playoffs, quote unquote, normally. But you could also argue this case. On the other hand, I mean, I don't know. It's nice to have some incentive for winning the division, and it wouldn't be that fun to exclude an entire division, an entire like region of the continent. from the playoffs. So I don't know. It doesn't occur very often where the division winner is that bad, anyways. All right, what else? Should we just mix both conferences into one and say fuck it, top 16 teams in the league get playoff spots? You do 1-16, 2-15, 3-14, 4-13, 5-12, and so on and so forth. No, because that would involve a lot of travel time unless you want to shorten the length of the playoff series. I don't think you should do that. Stanley Cup final involves a lot of travel time, but that's okay because it's the Stanley Cup final and you have to have it and it's really cool and everyone likes it. But in the first round, yeah, and also another point in the first round, like you have these matchups like Toronto, Boston, and whatever else. Like a few years ago, you would have stuff like Chicago, St. Louis, where both teams are really good and genuine Stanley Cup contenders. And then there's been the plight of Columbus, who keeps having to play Pittsburgh and Washington while being a very good team themselves, but they get knocked out in the first round by these also Cup contenders. On the one hand, it's not entirely fair for teams like Toronto, teams like whoever loses this series, teams like Columbus. But on the other hand, it's nice to have high powered matchups in the first round, even if it's not that fair objectively. This is what I'm saying about the current format. It's not good. I don't think it's good, but I think it's a lot of fun. Now, one more thing. Um, should the NHL expand their playoffs? No, because you already have more than half the teams. Once there's a 32nd team, it'll be exactly half. Um, So no, you don't need to expand the playoffs because eventually you get into the realm of teams that have losing records making the playoffs, and that's not good. Should the NHL, what's the opposite of expand? Reduce. That's not the right word I'm looking for, but it'll serve the purpose. Should the NHL reduce the amount of teams in the playoffs? Um, I don't think so. I like the first round. I think is one of the best the best times to be a hockey fan because you've got all of these series going on at the same time. They're all a lot of fun, and if you reduce that, it just make the first round of the playoffs a lot less fun. Also, I'm not convinced it's a good idea that like if you reduce the playoffs to 12 teams, say, then I just don't think that's good for the game of hockey. And the reason for that is that you get these teams like the 13 to 16 teams. These teams make deep playoff runs sometimes. And if you reduce the playoffs to say 12 teams, you will get teams that'll go decades without making the playoffs because some teams only squeeze in as a late seed. And if teams go decades without making the playoffs, I mean, that's not good for the fan base. The fan base will die out because, the way to expand hockey in a quote unquote non traditional hockey markets is you expose them to the playoffs, which is the best hockey that there is. And if teams are missing the playoffs for a long period of time, I can't fathom that's good for hockey for that to be happening. And plus, it's nice when teams that just barely sneak into the playoffs and on paper aren't very good make a deep playoff run. And sometimes, teams like Nashville in 2017 that went to the finals and proved to be basically the best team in the Western Conference and didn't come that far from winning the cup or at least forcing a game seven. Um, under a proposed shortened NHL playoffs, wouldn't even have made the playoffs and been able to show their valor. Um, okay, and the reason why I say this is, I don't know. In the MLB, they have smaller playoffs than the NHL, and this has always been really confusing to me because the MLB plays 162 regular season games in a season. They have the longest regular season by far in major professional sports, but they also have by far, not counting the NFL because the NFL has to have short playoffs and they have to have short seasons, and we know why that is. But if we're just talking the NHL, the NBA, which are both very similar, and the MLB has by far the shortest playoffs because not only do they sort of have 4 rounds, they've got the they don't call it the conference final, but just for clarity, the conference final and the final are both 7 games, but the second round equivalent is only 5 games, and the first round equivalent is a wild card game, which is just 1 game. So they basically have 3 quote unquote full rounds of playoffs, and also one of those is shorter than a 7 game series. So I don't understand. And people have give me reasons why not to do this. And I understand if you expand the MLB playoff format to 16 games, you will genuinely get teams making it in with a losing record sometimes. But I mean, it doesn't feel right that there are teams like the eighth best record in the league, like Cleveland this past season, don't get to make the playoffs, and teams like the Mariners don't make the playoffs for I don't know how long it's been, like a decade and a half, I think. Whereas under a 16 team playoff format, I read somewhere they'd have made it like 3 or 4 times at least. Always as like a wild card seed if you use the equivalent of the NHL format. But I can't imagine that it's good. Like I understand, you have to be like a competent front office and a competent team to make the playoffs. It's harder to make the playoffs in the MLB, but I can't imagine it's good for certain teams not to make the playoffs for like a decade and a half. I just can't imagine that's good for the sport. But I don't know. I don't really watch that much baseball. People tell me I'm stupid and wrong about this, so I'm gonna stop talking about it. But anyways, 1 to 8 is what I grew up with. I think it's good. I think it's probably objectively the best format. I haven't been able to come up with anything better, and I haven't seen any proposals that I think are better. The current playoff system, I think it's not as bad as some people say. I think it's a lot of fun. Yes, you can make arguments for why it's bad, and yes, you're probably very much correct to do so. But on the other hand, I think it has benefits, and I gotta say, I think I'm glad they changed it to this. I don't know, 1 to 8 can get a little dry sometimes. This is fun.